In our previous video, we saw how the action potential is generated on the axon and propagated by firing at adjacent locations, much like a series of dominoes falling over, one by one down the axon. Now, we can speed up that transmission of the action potential significantly by the presence of the myelin sheath. And how this works is the myelin sheath only allows the action potentials to fire at these exposed portions of the axon called the nodes of Ranvier, which are these bare patches of axon between the myelin sheaths. And because the action potential can only fire there, because the sodium channels can only open at those locations, then the action potential then jumps or hops down the axon. We call this saltatory conduction, a word that signifies jumping. So in this way, then, we don't have to go sequentially down the axon. We can move in big leaps and bounds, significantly speeding up the transmission. Now, when that transmission arrives at the end of an axon and connects to another cell, we call this the synapse. So these are the connections between a neuron and, in this case, another neuron, as you can see here. But of course, this could also be a connection to a muscle cell or a gland cell. Now, if you consider the direction of the nervous impulse down the axon, then we can distinguish between the cell before the synapse, the presynaptic cell, and the cell after the synapse, or the postsynaptic cell. And when the action potential arrives at the synapse, it triggers a release of chemicals called neurotransmitters. And those neurotransmitters move to the next cell and trigger another action potential there. Alright, let's take a look at the synapse in a little more detail. So what we have here is the end of an axon of what will be the presynaptic cell. So we'll have the action potential coming down in this direction. And then we have the postsynaptic cell down here with some channel proteins, some sodium protein channels embedded in its membrane. Now where these two neurons, or the neuron to the muscle cell, where they meet is called the synaptic cleft, this gap that forms. Okay, so here's our action potential arriving at the axon terminal. And when that action potential arrives, these vesicles containing the chemical message, which is called neurotransmitters, are going to be stimulated to migrate to the cell membrane at the synaptic cleft. We then have bulk transport, a form of bulk transport, exocytosis, occur, where those vesicles merge with the cell membrane and spill those neurotransmitters out into the synaptic cleft. That opens the sodium channels then, because you see how the neurotransmitters will bind to those sodium channels, causing them to open. Now, sodium is present in the synaptic cleft, and it will then be allowed to move in, generating an action potential. And in that way, we have an action potential generated in the postsynaptic cell, and we've successfully transferred that nervous impulse. Now, after that action potential fires, enzymes will degrade those neurotransmitters in order to close the sodium channels and prevent the further firing of that nerve. Okay, so let's take a look at the organization of the nervous system. It's split arbitrarily into the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which we collectively call the nerves of the body. So taking a look at the central nervous system, just the brain and spinal cord, these organs are made solely of interneurons. And of course, interneurons are those neurons that perform that all-important integration step. And most of the messages that come in from sensory receptors and sensory neurons to the central nervous system arrive at the brain for processing. The exception to this are reflexes. Reflexes only involve the spinal cord, so a message is sent to the spinal cord and then directly back out without including the brain. Reflexes work by traveling through a reflex arc, which includes the source of the stimulus and the spinal cord. So if we consider a pinprick in the arm generating the sensation of pain, that sensation, that nervous impulse, is going to be transmitted to the spinal cord by sensory neurons. Once at the spinal cord, that message is going to be integrated via an interneuron, which makes up the spinal cord, connecting that message, synapsing with a motor neuron. which is going to send a message back out to the arm muscle near the source of the pain, contracting it and causing you to move your arm away from that source of pain. So notice that in the reflex arc, we did not include the brain in the process of being able to react to the stimulus. This is completely an involuntary reaction. Okay, so the peripheral nervous system then, as we said, includes the nerves of the body. And you can see those in blue here on the diagram. And nerves are essentially just bundles of axons, a certain portion of sensory and motor neuron cells. For instance, if we take one of these nerves of the arm in yellow here, and we were to make a cross section of it and look into it, this is what we would see. And what you see here is in that one nerve a collection of bundles inside, and each of those bundles are filled with axons. And those axons, some of those axons are sensory neuron axons heading to the central nervous system. Some of them are motor neuron axons coming away from the central nervous system, all bundled together in what we call a nerve. So the peripheral nervous system then is further divided into the somatic system, which is responsible for skeletal muscle contractions. As you can see here, the skateboarder is controlling his body very particularly using his skeletal muscles to pull against bone to move his body in a certain way. And that's all what we call the somatic system, the nerves that innervate the skeletal muscles, versus the autonomic system, which is responsible for smooth muscle contractions. This is more of an internal, a visceral sort of system, where, for instance, we can consider the smooth muscle that makes up the digestive system. And recall that peristalsis is smooth muscle contractions that guide food through the digestive system, and of course those contractions would be governed by this autonomic system. The autonomic system, in turn, is further divided into the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division. Now, the difference between these two is is the state of emergency that occurs at times, which your response to is called the fight or flight. And those events that happen during a state of emergency are controlled by the sympathetic division. During relaxed times, when there isn't an emergency, the parasympathetic division takes over. So if we were to look at a list of things, for instance, that occur during the sympathetic division's control during a fight or flight response, you can see how peristalsis may slow down. We reduce the activity of your digestive system during an emergency. The release of adrenaline increases during a fight or flight situation. And of course, secreting digestive enzymes not as important during a fight or flight situation, and that will slow down as well.